The crystalline corridors of Drakemore Academy stretched like frozen lightning through the heart of the space station, each surface reflecting the cold radiance of distant stars. Ezra moved through these halls with the measured stride of someone who had learned to navigate alien architecture, without betraying the constant alertness that kept Deathworlders alive. 3 years of walking these same paths, and still, the Academy felt like a beautiful trap designed by minds that thought in geometries human brains weren't meant to comprehend. The other cadets gave him space as he passed, their conversations falling to whispers behind him. He caught fragments in a dozen different languages, but the meaning was always the same. There goes the human. There goes the one who thinks he belongs here. There goes the Deathworlder who refuses to know his place. Ezra had stopped caring about their whispers 2 years ago, when he'd realized that their skepticism was just another form of armor he could wear. Let them underestimate him. Let them think that human minds were too chaotic, too primitive, too bound by emotion to master the elegant mathematics of galactic warfare. They had no idea what was coming. The simulation chamber loomed ahead, its blast doors sealed tight as a tomb. For 2 centuries, the galaxy's most brilliant tactical minds had entered this room with confidence and emerged with their careers in ashes. The impossible test wasn't just Drakemore's final examination. It was a legend whispered in officer clubs across 50 systems. A scenario so perfectly calibrated to break the finest strategic thinking that some academies used it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence. Ezra paused before the doors, feeling the weight of history pressing against his shoulders like the gravity of a neutron star. Commander Dexhigh had explained the statistics with mathematical precision during the briefing. 0 successful completions in 200 years. Average time to surrender, 47 minutes. Psychological profiles of participants showed elevated stress hormones for months afterward, and 3 had required memory modification to function normally again. The Academy's instructors had been very clear about their expectations. This wasn't really a test at all, but a lesson in humility disguised as an assessment. The human cadet would enter the chamber, struggle valiantly against impossible odds, and emerge with a deeper understanding of his limitations. It would be educational, character building, a necessary step in transforming raw Deathworld aggression into something resembling civilized strategic thinking. They were about to learn why humans had conquered their own world before they'd even discovered fire. The blast doors began their ponderous opening sequence, heavy metal sliding away to reveal the sterile white interior of the simulation chamber. But Ezra's attention wasn't on the room itself. It was on the figure emerging from the opposite entrance, moving with the predatory grace that had made Altarians the galaxy's most feared strategic analysts. Lysenel. Even after 3 years of academic rivalry, the sight of her still hit him like a gravity well. She moved like liquid mercury given form, each step a masterpiece of controlled power. Her skin held the distinctive silver-blue luminescence of her species, patterns of darker markings spiraling across her arms and neck in configurations that spoke of genetic engineering perfected over millennia. But it was her eyes that stopped breath in his throat, violet depths threaded with veins of silver that seemed to calculate mathematical probabilities with every glance. She was everything he wasn't. Where he was intuitive, she was analytical. Where he relied on instinct honed by survival on humanity's deathworld, she deployed tactical frameworks refined through 10,000 years of Altarian military science. Where he saw chaos and opportunity, she saw patterns and probabilities. She was magnificent. She was impossible. She was the one person in the galaxy who could match his mind and challenge his assumptions and make him want to be better than he'd ever imagined possible. And she was walking toward the chamber where they would either destroy each other or discover something that would reshape the future of galactic warfare. Their eyes met across the threshold, and Ezra felt that familiar electric shock of recognition. For 3 years, they had been perfectly matched opponents. Two brilliant minds locked in academic combat that had elevated them both beyond anything their instructors had thought possible. Every simulation had been a chess match played at the speed of thought. Every tactical exercise had become a duel of intellects that left their classmates struggling to keep up. Now they were being asked to work together. Commander Dexhai materialized behind them with the unnerving silence that made Kethmori such effective military observers. The tall, insectoid alien's compound eyes glittered with what might have been amusement as he watched the two cadets size each other up like predators recognizing an equal. Cadet Ezra, Cadet Lysenel, you are about to enter a scenario that has broken the finest strategic minds in galactic history. The chamber will present you with a tactical situation of overwhelming complexity, designed to test not just your knowledge, but your ability to function under absolute pressure. You have been paired because your individual approaches to strategy are so fundamentally different that the Academy believes your combined perspectives might succeed where individual brilliance has failed. Ezra felt his pulse accelerate as the implications settled into his mind. They weren't just being tested on their ability to solve an impossible problem. They were being used as an experiment to see if human intuition and Altarian analysis could create something greater than the sum of their parts. The irony was that he'd been hoping for exactly this moment for months. Not because he wanted to prove anything to the Academy, but because he wanted to see what happened when Lysenel stopped trying to predict his moves and started working with them instead. The chamber awaits. Commander Dexhai gestured toward the open doorway with one of his 4 arms. You have unlimited time and complete access to all tactical databases. The scenario will begin once you are both inside and the doors have sealed. Good luck. Ezra stepped forward first, his boots ringing against the metal floor with the distinctive sound of a human refusing to be intimidated. Behind him, he heard Lysenel's much quieter footsteps, the soft whisper of Altarian gravity boots designed for silent movement. The chamber was larger than he'd expected, a perfect sphere 20 meters in diameter with curved walls that would serve as display surfaces once the simulation began. 2 command consoles rose from the floor like metallic flowers, their interfaces glowing with soft blue light that cast shifting shadows across the pristine surfaces. The doors sealed behind them with a sound like the universe holding its breath. For a moment, they stood in perfect silence, 2 minds preparing for a challenge that had humbled the greatest strategic thinkers in known space. Then the walls came alive. Stars exploded into existence around them, a 3-dimensional map of local space rendered in perfect detail. Fleet positions materialized as glowing markers, friendly forces in green, enemy formations in angry red. Civilian populations showed as golden clusters, supply lines as silver threads connecting system to system in a web of interstellar logistics. The scope was staggering. Ezra felt his breath catch as he absorbed the full magnitude of what they were facing. 17 enemy fleets, 4 allied systems under direct assault, civilian populations trapped behind enemy lines, supply corridors severed, reinforcement schedules disrupted, communication networks compromised. It was beautiful in its hopelessness. A tactical puzzle designed by someone who understood exactly how strategic minds worked and how to break them with mathematical precision. Lysenel moved to the primary console, her fingers already dancing across holographic controls with the practiced efficiency that had made her the Academy's most feared simulation opponent. Data streams flowed around her like liquid light as she began building probability matrices and calculating defensive scenarios. Ezra watched her work for 30 seconds, memorizing the elegant efficiency of her movements. The way her silver-marked skin caught the reflected glow of the tactical displays. Then he moved to the secondary console and began pulling up entirely different data: personnel manifests, supply requisitions, communication intercepts, maintenance schedules, the messy, human details that elegant strategic thinking usually ignored. "What are you doing?" Her voice carried that distinctive Altarian accent, consonants crisp as breaking glass, vowels flowing like liquid mercury. Even after 3 years, the sound of her speaking his language with that precise, musical intonation made something deep in his chest tighten with longing. Looking for the story behind the math, Ezra highlighted a series of supply transfers that seemed routine until viewed in context. Wars aren't won by the most brilliant strategies, Lysenal. They're won by the people who understand that strategy is just organized chaos. She stepped closer, violet eyes scanning his data with the focused intensity that had made her legendary among the Academy's instructors. Her proximity sent heat racing through his nervous system, the scent of her homeworld's atmosphere clinging to her uniform like exotic perfume. These are logistical details: maintenance records, personnel transfers. How is this relevant to tactical planning? Ezra pulled up another data stream, building a picture that had nothing to do with fleet movements and everything to do with understanding the minds behind them. Because whoever designed this scenario made one critical mistake. They assumed we'd think like strategists instead of thinking like humans. The enemy formations began their first wave of attacks, red markers spreading across the display like drops of blood in water. Conventional tactical doctrine demanded immediate response, defensive positions reinforced, counterattacks launched to relieve pressure on besieged systems. Instead, Ezra began tracing communication patterns, looking for the subtle indicators that revealed how the enemy command structure actually functioned. Not the elegant organizational charts that military analysts preferred, but the messy reality of how information flowed between commanders under stress. "Show me." Lysenal's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, that particular tone she used when her analytical mind encountered something that didn't fit her calculated predictions. He gestured to the supply manifests he'd been analyzing. Their rear guard is shipping medical supplies to 3 systems that aren't under attack. Standard procedure would be to consolidate medical resources near combat zones. But look at the quantities. These aren't emergency supplies. They're preparing for massive casualties in areas that should be completely safe. Her eyes widened as she processed the implications, silver threads in her irises catching the light like stars being born. You think they're planning to sacrifice those systems. Not sacrifice. Transform. Ezra pulled up personnel records, showing her the pattern he'd discovered buried in routine transfer orders. Look at where they're moving their best ground commanders, away from the front lines, away from the obvious targets. They're positioning their most valuable assets in defensive roles on worlds that every tactical manual would classify as strategically insignificant. Lysenal leaned closer, studying his analysis with growing excitement. Her shoulder brushed against his, and Ezra felt his concentration fragment for a dangerous moment as awareness of her presence overwhelmed his tactical thinking. They're not trying to win this engagement. Her voice held a note of wonder, as if she were discovering a new law of physics. They're trying to lose it in a specific way that sets up their next campaign. For the first time since he'd known her, Lysenal looked genuinely surprised. That's completely illogical. No commander sacrifices current strategic advantage for theoretical future benefit. Ezra turned to face her fully, close enough to see the intricate patterns of silver threading through her violet eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Every human commander does. We call it strategic patience. Sometimes you have to lose the battle to win the war. The simulation around them escalated, alarms blaring as enemy fleets pressed their apparent advantage. Civilian populations reported casualties. Allied defensive positions began showing stress fractures. The logical response was clear. Reinforce the failing positions, launch counterattacks to relieve pressure, follow every principle of defensive warfare that military academies had taught for centuries. Instead, Ezra began pulling up star charts of systems 3 jumps behind the enemy advance. "Show me how your mind works." His voice was low, intense, carrying an invitation that had nothing to do with tactical planning, and everything to do with 3 years of academic tension finally finding an outlet. "Show me how you calculate possibilities when chaos becomes the only variable that matters." Lysenel's fingers flew across her console, building probability trees that branched into thousands of potential outcomes. But now she was factoring in his human insights, using his understanding of irrational decision-making to modify her elegant mathematical models. "If they want us to respond conventionally," she said, her voice gaining confidence as she adapted to his way of thinking, "then conventional response becomes the trap. We need to do exactly what no rational strategist would consider." Ezra felt his heart rate accelerate as he watched her magnificent mind adapt to his chaotic human perspective. "Instead of defending the systems under attack, we hit their supply lines 3 systems behind their advance. We ignore the obvious threat and attack the foundation they're building their real strategy on. But that leaves millions of civilians at risk." Her voice carried the precise concern of someone trained to optimize for minimal casualties, to find solutions that protected the greatest number of lives, which is exactly what they're counting on. Ezra met her gaze, letting her see the steel beneath his tactical flexibility. "They think we'll prioritize short-term humanitarian concerns over long-term strategic necessity. They're using our compassion as a weapon against us." Understanding flowed across her features like dawn breaking over an alien landscape. Humans don't just fight wars. You endure them. You adapt. You find ways to survive when any rational analysis would demand surrender. The simulation pressed its attack, enemy formations consolidating their apparent victories, while Allied positions reported catastrophic losses. The mathematical conclusion was inescapable. They were losing, and losing badly. Every tactical principle demanded immediate response to prevent total collapse. Instead, they began implementing a strategy that would have gotten them court-martialed in any military academy in known space. Fast attack squadrons launched from concealed positions, racing past enemy formations to strike at supply depots, and communication relays deep behind enemy lines. Rather than reinforcing failure, they committed their reserves to what appeared to be a suicidal assault on targets that tactical doctrine would classify as secondary at best. For 23 minutes, their strategy looked like catastrophic failure. Enemy forces consolidated their positions in captured systems. Civilian casualties mounted as defensive positions collapsed. Their own forces appeared scattered and ineffective, small unit actions that seemed to have no connection to any coherent strategic vision. The academy instructors watching from the observation deck murmured in confusion and growing concern. By every measure they understood, the test was proceeding exactly as expected. 2 brilliant minds were learning the hard lesson that some problems simply couldn't be solved, no matter how innovative the approach. Then the enemy supply lines began to collapse. It started as a whisper in the communications intercepts, commanders reporting minor delays in ammunition shipments. Then, fuel convoys began missing their schedules. Medical supplies disappeared. Reinforcement schedules dissolved into chaos as the infrastructure supporting the enemy advance crumbled system by system. Without ammunition, fuel, or reinforcements, the enemy fleets found themselves trapped in hostile territory with no way to maintain their positions. What had looked like brilliant tactical success became strategic disaster as their forces began surrendering system by system, cut off from the supplies that made continued fighting possible. Lysenel stared at the tactical display as enemy fleet markers began switching from red to green, surrender cascading through their formations like dominoes falling in slow motion. In 41 minutes, you've accomplished what 2 centuries of strategic thinking couldn't achieve. Ezra felt the adrenaline of victory mixing with something deeper and more complex as he turned to face her. We accomplished it. Your calculations made my intuition possible. Without your mathematical models, I couldn't have predicted how fast their supply network would collapse. Something shifted in her expression, violet eyes searching his face with an intensity that had nothing to do with tactical analysis. For 3 years, you've been the only opponent who could challenge me. The only mind that could match mine and force me to evolve beyond what I thought possible. The space between them seemed to contract, measured in heartbeats rather than meters. The simulation powered down around them, stars fading to reveal the sterile chamber walls, but neither of them moved. They stood frozen in a moment that felt like the real test had just begun. You realize what this means. Her voice was barely above a whisper, carrying implications that went far beyond military strategy. Ezra stepped closer, close enough to see the rapid pulse at her throat, the slight parting of her lips as her breathing quickened. That we just became the only team in Academy history to pass the impossible test. Her smile was slow and devastating, transforming her face from alien perfection into something warm and achingly beautiful, that we're going to be assigned to work together for the rest of our careers. The thought should have been intimidating. 3 years of competitive tension, of challenging each other to excel, of finding in each other the only mind capable of true intellectual sparring. Now they would be partners, thrust into situations where their combined tactical brilliance would be tested against real enemies in real conflicts. Instead, it felt like the promise of everything he hadn't dared to want. I've spent 3 years trying to understand how you think. Lysenel's voice carried a vulnerability he'd never heard before. The perfect Altarian strategist revealing depths that had nothing to do with military analysis, trying to predict your moves, counter your strategies, find the flaws in your logic. And now, Ezra reached for her hand, feeling her fingers intertwine with his in a gesture that was simple, automatic, and completely right. Now I want to understand everything else. Her thumb traced across his knuckles, the touch electric with possibility. The way you smile when you think no one's watching. The way you frown when you're solving problems that shouldn't have solutions. The way you look at me when you think I don't notice. Heat spread through his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with the woman standing close enough to kiss. I look at you like you're the most magnificent thing in the galaxy. Her breath caught, and for a moment the perfect Altarian strategist became simply a woman whose defenses were crumbling. Because that's exactly how I look at you. The chamber doors began their opening sequence, the sound of approaching footsteps echoing from the corridor beyond. Academy instructors would flood in within moments, demanding explanations and detailed analysis of their unprecedented success. Questions would be asked, strategies dissected, reports written that would reshape military thinking across the galaxy. But in the seconds before the outside world intruded, Ezra cupped her face in his hands, feeling the warm silk of her skin beneath his palms. Her eyes closed, silver lashes casting shadows across those distinctive markings that made her so achingly alien and so perfectly beautiful. When their lips met, it was like discovering a new kind of mathematics, a calculation that balanced intuition with analysis, chaos with order, human passion with Altarian precision. The kiss tasted like victory and possibility, and the promise of challenges that would make their academy rivalry look simple. They broke apart as voices echoed from the corridor, academy officials rushing toward the chamber where the impossible had just become inevitable. But they didn't step away from each other, fingers still intertwined, foreheads touching in a gesture of intimacy that spoke louder than any tactical analysis. The impossible test was just the beginning. Lysenel's words were soft against his lips, a promise that carried the weight of shared futures and conquered galaxies. Ezra squeezed her hand as the first instructors burst into the chamber, their expressions mixing shock with grudging admiration and barely concealed academic excitement. She was right. They'd just proven that two minds working in perfect harmony could achieve the impossible. Now, they had the rest of their lives to discover what other impossibilities they could conquer together. Commander Dexhigh led the flood of Academy officials, his compound eyes glittering with something that might have been satisfaction as he observed their continued proximity. Behind him came strategic analysts, tactical instructors, and senior officers whose careers had been built on understanding the theoretical limits of military thinking. Cadet Ezra, Cadet Lysenel. The Kethmori's voice carried harmonics that suggested deep approval. In 41 minutes and 37 seconds, you have accomplished what this academy believed to be mathematically impossible. Your approach was unconventional. Ezra felt Lysenel's fingers tighten in his, drawing strength from their connection as the reality of what they'd achieved began to settle around them. We identified patterns in the enemy's strategic planning that conventional analysis would have missed, sir, by thinking like humans instead of thinking like strategists, and by combining human intuition with Altarian mathematical modeling. Lysenel's voice carried new confidence, the authority of someone who had just redefined the possible. The scenario was designed to break individual brilliance. It wasn't prepared for genuine partnership. The instructors exchanged glances loaded with implications that would reshape academy curriculum for generations to come. If two minds working in harmony could accomplish what individual genius could not, then perhaps the entire foundation of military education needed to be reconsidered. Your tactical innovations will be studied for decades. Commander Dexhigh's attention shifted between them with the mechanical precision of someone calculating probabilities. More immediately, your demonstrated ability to function as a strategic unit makes you ideal candidates for the Nexus Division's Advanced Command Program. Ezra felt his pulse spike as the implications settled into his mind. The Nexus Division was where the galaxy's most critical conflicts were managed, where strategic decisions were made that affected billions of lives across hundreds of worlds. It was where war heroes were forged and legends were born. It was also where they would be working together, facing challenges that would make Academy simulations look like children's games. We would be honored to serve, sir. His voice carried the steady confidence of someone who had just discovered that impossible was simply another word for untested. Lysenel stepped closer, her shoulder brushing against his in a gesture that looked casual but felt like a promise. We function better as a team than either of us ever did individually. The debriefing lasted for hours, tactical analysts dissecting every decision they'd made and trying to understand how human chaos and Altarian order could combine into something greater than the sum of their parts. They answered questions about resource allocation and strategic timing, about psychological factors and mathematical modeling, about the dozens of small innovations that had transformed failure into victory. But through it all, they maintained their connection. Hands finding each other during breaks, glances that carried conversations no Academy instructor could decrypt. The growing awareness that what they'd discovered in the simulation chamber went far beyond military applications. As the formal debriefing concluded, and Academy officials dispersed to write reports that would reshape strategic thinking across the galaxy. Ezra and Lysenel found themselves alone in the observation deck, overlooking Drakemore's central hub. Through the massive transparisteel viewport, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human ambition and alien precision. Do you think they know? Lysenel's voice carried amusement as she watched the last of the instructors disappear down the corridor. That we just figured out how to solve impossible problems. Ezra moved to stand behind her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. I think they're starting to understand that human and Altarian thinking might be more compatible than anyone imagined. She leaned back against him, her head finding the perfect spot against his shoulder. That's not what I meant. He knew exactly what she meant. The Academy might be celebrating their tactical breakthrough, but what they'd really discovered was something far more dangerous and far more powerful than strategic innovation. They'd found each other. I don't care if they know. His arms circled her waist, holding her against him as starlight painted silver patterns across her skin. Let them think this is about military applications and strategic partnerships. What matters is that we know what we found. She turned in his arms, violet eyes searching his face with the same intensity she'd once brought to tactical analysis. And what have we found? The answer came without conscious thought, carried on certainty that felt as fundamental as gravity. Someone worth conquering galaxies for. Her smile was radiant, transforming alien beauty into something that stopped time itself. Then I suppose we'd better start practicing. The future stretched before them like an uncharted star map, filled with challenges that would test everything they'd learned about strategy and partnership and love. The Nexus division would throw them into conflicts where their combined brilliance would be the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. But they would face it together. Two minds that had learned to function as one, two hearts that had discovered that the most powerful force in the galaxy wasn't superior firepower or brilliant strategy. It was perfect partnership. As they stood together in the observation deck, watching stars that had burned for billions of years before humans ever dreamed of reaching space, Ezra felt the certainty settle into his bones. They had passed the impossible test, but that was just the first movement in a symphony that would reshape the galaxy. The impossible test was complete. The impossible future had just begun.